I think does provoke people to ask that question of themselves, and also obviously to learn from another person's experience. And I think that the stories that you've told so far, each one of them has, you learn something from them. You've been able to draw out a sort of a structure or a theme or an element which has been representing an insight that person has had into life. And those insights are really quite important.
My guest in this episode is my friend and mentor, Peter Berry. Peter has served society as a psychotherapist, teacher and trainer for more than 40 years. He has come to explore the impossibility of the Unlived Lives project. Peter, welcome.
Thank you.
Good to have you. Thanks so much for coming on.
It's good to be here, Jack, in
Amazing.
this extraordinary setup.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so lucky. It's so good to have it and use it.
Yeah.
What do you mean by the impossibility?
Well, I said that when I said that to you, it was a little bit of hyperbole, but I think what I was trying to say in that moment was that really there's a sort of subtlety to the question. There's the familiarity that we have in talking about ourselves. There's that sense in which there's the convention that we have in people talking about themselves, the narrative they give of their lives, the stories that they tell of their lives, the way they present themselves, the selves that they present. And all of that that aspect of the project that you're involved in is a very familiar one to all of us. But parallel to that, and setting a different side to that, is the question that we're always managing the presentation of ourselves, and that the act of managing the presentation of ourselves changes the sense we have of ourselves, the way we think about ourselves, the way we talk about ourselves. Tends to shape and craft a self that is familiar to us, or shape and craft a self that is familiar to those people that we're talking to. So that we're sort of in agreement. We build an agreement between each other that this is who we are, and this is how we are, and this is what we're doing, and this is where we're going, and so on. And I suppose it reminds me of the idea in physics, particle physics, which I don't know anything about, but I know enough to know that there's an idea called the indeterminacy theory, where the very act of observing the particle physics means that you've affected them, you've changed them in some way. And so, in a sense, I think in a parallel way, there's a sense in which when we think about ourselves, when we speak about ourselves, when we present ourselves to the world, we're actually manifesting a narrative about us, and the idea that there's an us which is absolute, solid, and can be known, I think is a real problem. And it's not a bad problem, it's just an interesting problem. And we set aside, alongside that, a notion that when we're thinking about ourselves, when we're thinking about who we are, we do often desperately need to be reassured that we are who we are by the people we're speaking to. So as I say, there's that sort of a complicity between the two people in a conversation. And of course, my life as a psychotherapist has meant that I've been working alongside people for whom this question about who they are is actually a real problem. Or that the who that they think they are is a problem. And so in a sense, I would say that I've lived a parallel life with this the familiar, which I'm familiar with, which is, that I chose how I was going to get dressed this morning, or that I was,
sure.
That's how I was going to present myself, that I was nervous about sitting in front of a camera, and, that, and that, of course, we are sitting here with, 1, 2, 3 cameras around us, a lighting rig above us, and kit across the table.
That's going to change how you present yourself.
It changes how I present myself, and it's the same for you, Jack. And we sort of have this moment where we're having this conversation. We've got a coffee. We're organising ourselves here, and then suddenly you start, and we suddenly move into a different register, a different sort of register that. We're being very thoughtful about what we say, or we're observing ourselves saying what we're saying,
sure,
in a way that we weren't a few moments before, or
indeed do regularly at all.
Or indeed. Now, for those of us who are continuously observing ourselves, and many people who are continuously observing themselves in a critical way, are people who find their way to my consulting room to work with me, because in a sense their self-observation has ceased to be ordinary self-observation, but hypercritical self-observation. And we suffer from that hypercritical self-observation. So that again sets our lives aside from other lives, because if we're observing ourselves in this absolutely hyper-critical level, then we are living an unhappy life.
Because that's all we're doing.
Because that's all we're doing. That's all we know. And those of us who live like that desperately need to find a way out of that trap, out of the trap of self-observation, into a sort of ordinary observation, in an observation where we're neither special nor awful. We're just sort of, to use my word, ordinary. And I think that's a very helpful place to be just very ordinary.
And achieve some sort of degree of contentment with oneself, where you can get on with making the decisions about whether you have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. And to be happy, So I think that was what I meant anyway. If that perhaps it's a long-winded, very long-winded way of answering the question. But it's obviously it's sort of a curious idea, because it's the opposite. As you're saying, you're exploring something which is not possible, and so on the face of it, that seems very like, well, then what's the point? But maybe that's the point. Yeah, I think so. What is the point? And that's a very good question. What is the point? But I think what we're trying to do when we're asking about the unlived life is to try and catch a moment where someone has a thought, something that occurs to them, something that they didn't think before, or that the sitting down with you, with that question in front of them, actually enables them to look again at their life, to represent to themselves their life, and think, could it have been like that, or what was I thinking then, or so as much as I want to characterize it as a sort of impossible thing to do, for various reasons, which perhaps I might go on to talk about a bit more, it's still a very exciting thing to do. Helpful
thing to do. And of course, I mean, inevitably, when you ask a person that question, when in their life you ask them that question, you'll get a different answer.
Absolutely.
And that answer will change from interview to interview to interview. If you interview the same person a week later, the impact of their discussion with you might have enabled them to rethink themselves, to notice something about themselves, to think, I didn't realize that about me, or that was true, but it may be there's more to it than that. So there's an unfolding.
And sort of what you're saying seems to be very much about being helpful to the person, the person in the chair.
Yeah.
But because I'm filming this, I'm recording this, how do you think it might help? What's the point? How do you think it might be helpful, if at all, for other people to witness that? Because otherwise we could just have a private conversation. We've had many lovely private conversations about wonderful topics and things such as this. So why share it?
Well, I think that's two things there. I think one is that it's entertaining. And, one of my favorite radio programs is Desert Island Discs.
Sure.
Because inevitably, whenever you sit and listen to it, you think, no, that wouldn't be on my list, or I wouldn't have done it that way.
Yeah.
Or I wish I could go on Desert Island Discs, because there's a sense in which the narrative that one builds and the story that one tells of oneself and one's life and crafts it to produce this beautiful object called Desert Island Disc, that person's 8 choices and so on, has a sort of polish to it, has a sort of completeness about it, And that we love to think of our lives as having a narrative and a completeness about it. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And
a summary. It's easier
summary,
to,
And the idea of summing up a life in 8 pieces of music, I think is a wonderful idea. So in a sense, there's a parallel narrative here, isn't there? What is the unlived aspect of your life, or what did you miss, or what haven't you done, and what would you want to do, and so on. All of those questions,
based on the decisions that you made, or not.
Yeah, that's right. And just like, say, to use Desert Island Discs as a sort of instance, like that, sitting, listening to and watching, a video like this, I think does provoke people to ask that question of themselves, and also obviously to learn from another person's experience. And I think the stories that you've told so far, each one of them has, you learn something from them. You've been able to draw out a sort of a structure or a theme or an element which has been representing an insight that person has had into life. And those insights are really quite important for them, and also for the observer to think, that's a good point. I like that point.
Perhaps a philosophy that they've come up with based upon their experience to push them through life, to make the decision to get up at 6 a.m. or whatever.
Yeah. I think that's true. That's really helpful. So I suppose it's about actually offering up something which enables someone to reflect on their own life and learn from the life of another person.
Do you think the Unlived Lives project is efficient in that?
That's an interesting question. It's efficient.
Do you think there would be a way to get to the result faster if the result is sharing philosophy?
No, I don't. I think that I don't think you need to. I don't think there's a more efficient way of putting it. Of doing it. I think it's to do with the way that human beings meander in the way that they represent themselves or think about themselves. They don't go straight to the point. And if they go straight to the point, it's a point they've known about for years, and they're not saying anything new. I think what's so important about an interview with someone is to produce an environment in which they can have a thought that they haven't thought before. Yes, that they can represent themselves in all the familiar ways they do, but they can have a moment where I hadn't thought that before.
Because you see the rehearsal otherwise.
Yeah.
You get a sense of that.
That's right, because the danger is we're always rehearsing ourselves.
Indeed. That presentation, as you're saying. Yeah.
And of course, our culture at this moment, which we're an instance of at this phenomena here is an instance of our culture, which is about the fascination that we have about ourselves, and the fascination we have about ourselves it goes back to that idea of Andy Warhol, everyone's going to be famous for 15 minutes. Here's my 15 minutes sort of thing, or in this case, maybe 45 or something. But it's a narcissistic culture. We live in a narcissistic culture. The media generates ideals, the idea of celebrityhood. The idea of the celebrity is a phenomenon that's come about, certainly in my lifetime, probably in the last 20 or 30 years, and it's reached a level where celebrity and politics and show business and all sorts of things are all woven together, and it's very difficult to pick out whether it's I've listened to a podcast of Obama and Springsteen, which is them talking about, basically music and American way of life. And you couldn't put a cigarette paper between the two of them in terms of the way they present themselves, slick, efficient, if you want.
Sure.
And really very, very engaging, fascinating. So, and I think that's a point about fascination as well, which is another thing we often think about. He or she is fascinating, and that's a very interesting word because it has its the idea of fascination. It comes from a sort of Latin, I think it's fasces, to bind or to grip. Yeah, so that we're in the grip of someone's face. The face comes from fasces, has its origins in to bind, to grip. The face grips us. So we're in cultures where we're narcissistically engaged in how we present ourselves, how we look, how we're seen, how we're able to gauge and draw in another person, the grip we can have on them. And that's part of the celebrityhood, that you see a celebrity in the street and you're fascinated, you're turned to look at them, you're gripped by them.
And social media having taken that face and provided a perfect veil for all the stuff that you sweep under the carpet, and then you just presented with this perfect face. Absolutely.
That polish that we're able to put on it, the cosmetic overlay of polish and smoothness and beautiful surfaces and beautiful lighting and drone shots.
Sure.
I mean, the number of drone shots we see on YouTube is just sort of beyond belief. And they're wonderful because we see the world from a different point of view, and we can be fascinated.
From places that we never would have been able to see them.
Never would have been
ever.
able to see. Yeah.
That's such a big world. There's no chance. I mean, my hope for it, really, the project, is to sort of perhaps be some sort of force against the extraordinary. That extraordinary lifestyle that you see on social media, and actually just talking about ordinary feelings, perhaps ordinary ideas that we all have our own answer to. It's a question. The questions I aim to sort of ask are all questions that anybody could have an answer to.
Yeah.
And then therefore every answer is different. And I'm hoping that with every answer, there's a new piece of philosophy or a new idea or a new insight into how to get through that might help someone.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair comment. I don't doubt that's a possibility. And because in a sense you're engaging a person to speak about who they are and who they feel they are and who they believe they are. And I think that is inevitably going to be informative and inspiring.
To others.
To others, yes. Because, I've been thinking, I obviously watched the videos, and, how people have lived their lives is inspiring because it enables you to see that lives are not perfect and polished, and they are incomplete, and they are fragmented, and we do we do stitch ourselves together from different aspects of who we think we are at times.
And say and are and
yeah, and
what and who and on camera or make mistakes.
I make mistakes, and that's a very ordinary part of the world, a very ordinary thing for us to do, and it can be very reassuring to see how other people make the same mistakes as we do or have the same difficulties.
To what extent do you feel like it's an ever-increasing difficulty to sit through a piece of entertainment, which highlights the ordinary? So not editing out the ums and ahs, the flailing, the, thinking, the facial expression of going, oh, I haven't thought about that before. That's something I'm sort of trying to keep in as much as possible within reason. Do you think that's helpful? Do you think that is going to put people off?
No, I don't think it's going to put people off. I think that the question that I think that there is a certain pleasure in seeing rawness and seeing unpolished moments. But we're all wanting to see behind the curtain, behind the screen, and we're all curious about how it is and how it was. And so, in a sense, I think you are representing that aspect of lives, things that conversations that you can't have with a person, that you're seeing it being had and thinking, oh, I wouldn't have asked that question. I would have asked a different question. Or why did you not pick that up? I think you missed something there. So the unpolished and the raw is always very much more interesting because we're so good at polishing ourselves. We're so good at being polished. And those people who are not good at polishing themselves could be...
Sasha, thank you. Sasha, enough. Boys, thank you. Sasha, thank you. Are we done? Come on, in your bed. Nuno?
So there's a beautiful illustration of the unpolished moment.
Indeed.
Suddenly, ordinary life inserts itself in the narrative that we're constructing here. Something comes in from off stage, something comes in to remind ourselves that we're on the stage, because this is not part of how it should be. This is not what we're wanting to do or not what we're expecting. So the dog's barking at someone coming in. Suddenly you come out of it, and having to pacify the dogs and having to sort of change their position and encourage them to settle down is all part of that intrusion. And the intrusion suddenly highlights the artifice of what we're constructing here. And we return to the artifice. You and I are reasonably skilled enough to return to the narrative and to the artifice of what we're producing here.
So it's that impossibility of actually ever being perfect, truly.
Well, the impossibility of being perfect, it's a really good point, perfect. Because there isn't such a thing as perfect. Perfect is an ideal, not an object. It's an ideal. It's like the truth. There isn't the truth. There are truths. There's truthfulness, and there's the ideal. But there's no. We see that as an aspiration, perhaps, we aspire to produce something.
We should.
Yeah, we should aspire. Yeah, we
see
should
it
aspire.
as an aspiration rather than an objective.
Yeah, because we can't. Because we're a work in progress. I mean, people are a sort of work in progress. They're not fixed. They're not final. And for those of us who feel that we must be fixed or we must be final, we must be finished in some way, polished in some way. I think that idea will make us unhappy because we will always be failing. But if we accept ourselves as a work in progress, then we see that there is no destination. There's no absolute destination. We're never going to be there. We're always going to be.
Well, the destination is when we're not there.
Yeah. So I think keeping it in the form of like the insertion of the dog's barking, I think is part of the reminder of the ordinariness of what we're trying to do, and how if we keep on polishing it, trying to perfect it, we miss out on life.
Sure,
we miss out on the dog's barking. We miss out on the pleasure of seeing the dogs bark and. The humour of them dog barking in the middle of our...
Do you mind?
Do you mind?
Yeah.
And, can you settle down, lads? But that was as much part of this moment as the words we're uttering now, and the conversation we're having now.
And has had an effect on it.
It has, yeah.
And sort of going back to being in the chair.
Yeah.
The consequences of being filmed versus not. Being recorded and not, certainly to people who have perhaps no experience in being so, and therefore are completely untrained in putting on that mask, I think for those brave enough, could be very interesting and helpful.
I think you're right. And I think one of the things I noticed about it when I was watching some of the videos was the fact that everyone there was new to the trade, new to the business, but at the same time, they were in a sort of native way, not in a sort of trained way, but in a sort of native intelligence, just being ordinary intelligence, being an inhabitant of the business of being an ordinary presenter of oneself. They were having to reframe themselves in some way in front of the camera, and I think they all did it very well. They all sort of reached up in some way. They, both you and they polished something or produced something more than themselves. I think there was a sense in which everyone was trying to reach for something true about themselves. And I think that's a wonderful opportunity for people to be given. Yeah.
And even though that's never said, all I sort of do is send them an invite, which is a web page, and sort of say, this is what this idea is. Don't show anybody the questions that comes on beforehand, and just drop it in front of them. Yeah. And because the idea is that it's an exploration. They explore it on the go rather than coming, as you say, with a pre-prepared answer. And so we're seeing that exploration happen, and hopefully inspiring those watching to think about that as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. But again, I'm returning to the idea, it raises questions about I suppose it raises questions about the idea that there is such a thing as a fixed person, a person who knows themselves, a person who knows the history, a person who remembers everything that is appropriate or salient in that moment, and an idea of a person who sufficiently understands themselves to be able to represent themselves efficiently, effectively, clearly. Use your word efficient. That quite often we're missing the point. Quite often we don't remember things that might be quite relevant in that situation. we're doing our best to produce a narrative sense of who we are, and that we're managing the anxieties of the interview, both the pleasurable excitement of the interview and the unpleasurable excitement of the interview, the anxiety that comes with being put on the spot, as it were. The anxiety of having to believe that you're going to have something interesting to say. The anxiety that when you're being watched, you're going to be watched benignly and lovingly, as opposed to judgmentally and contemptuously. All of those things we're having to manage when we're in a situation like this.
And an element that there must be a leap of faith.
Yeah, we have that leap of faith. A leap of faith in ourselves, as well as a leap of faith in the audience, that the audience is going to be interested in what we're talking about and not disinterested or contemptuous, because this is, of course, one of the things that we're having to manage in the world, which is the way in which we have to defend ourselves against anxiety. I think for people I work with, how they live with anxiety, or as I would put it, it illustrates the problem of how we live with anxiety, because I don't see, when I refer to the idea of my patients, I don't refer to them as another species.
Sure.
They're merely iterations or reiterations of the ordinary and everyday person, and to which I'm one.
There's a bit of all of us in everyone.
Absolutely, and that's something we have to remember. So when we're looking at someone contemptuously, in a sense, that's because partly we're looking at ourselves contemptuously. But I think the anxiety that we live with in our society, which is an ordinary anxiety, which is, are we loved? Are we cared for? Are we accepted? Are we wanted? Are we needed? All of those questions that we live with, how we defend against that anxiety is very significant, because it tends to manifest itself in ways in which we represent ourselves to the world. If we feel unloved, then we try to represent ourselves as something worth loving. Or we are keen to be seen as something worth loving. We present ourselves as much as we can as something worth loving. Or indeed, if we are frightened of being loved and unloved, if we're frightened of being loved because being loved is dangerous, then of course we can be unloving and represent ourselves as someone not worth loving. And the danger is we believe these things about ourselves. We believe that we're unloved, or we believe that we are unloving. And I think it's really important for people to notice that about themselves, that their beliefs about themselves, the way they defend themselves about them.
And to have an ability to see that in others.
Yeah, absolutely. Because what is happening to us is happening in another at the same time.
We're so good at putting up the veil, and hiding all of that, that we don't recognise it often. We're
so glossy, to put it that way, so glib at doing this that we don't notice it. And I think the phenomena that we live with every day, people who come to see me and people like me are coming to see them because they're not as good at doing it as others. They're just not as good at doing it. And there's a sort of a self-reflection. We fall back on ourselves. We look at ourselves from a position of contempt or grandiosity. I think we either inflate ourselves to enormous grandiosity, or we deflate ourselves with enormous grandiosity. We see ourselves as terrible people, and we see ourselves as wonderful people. And both of those, we create suffering for ourselves when we see ourselves as a wonderful person, and when we see ourselves as an awful person. That's suffering. Ordinariness is somewhere in the middle, where we're neither special nor awful nor anything, but just ordinary, getting on with our lives. But we suffer from the idea that we have to be something special, or we're not something special, or we're something terrible, and so on. This sort of
ongoing,
inevitable sort of different formations of that.
In my journey as a wannabe philosopher, I have done quite a bit of reading over lockdown. And perhaps somewhat very, very late to the party, but I've discovered Nietzsche.
Oh, yeah.
And I have discovered that he said, really the journey is about becoming who you are. And that idea of becoming who you are, and why we can't just be who we are now at the start, if there is another way of putting, we're all on a journey to perfection. Could perfection actually be becoming who you are, in that if you're not who you are already, why are you not? And how did that start? And why can't you get there?
All big questions. Questions. I mean, for me, the question of becoming who we are is again, I think, a problem. Being who we are sort of rather implies that there's something that we are which we need to become. That there's a destination, that we become who we are. And I'm not sure about that. I mean, I know what he's saying, sure. And I know what people say, but what they sort of mean when they say that. We're invited into sort of nodding of our heads and saying, yeah, that makes sense, become who we are. I suppose if there's not a sort of thing that we are, that we have to become, a sort of destination, a perfection, a polishing, perhaps one way I would prefer to put it is that we become present in our lives, fully present in our lives, where we are. Where we are right now, become fully present in that moment, and to live in a full presence of that moment as that moment changes. So vividly being who we are is being right here, right now, alive and alert and thoughtful and kind and loving. That would seem to me to be a huge achievement. And I think most of us spend our lives dipping into those moments and dipping out. We spend most of our lives sort of managing that excitement, by distraction. I think it's very hard to be truly present.
That's it, isn't it? I'm fascinated with this idea of not needing perhaps an exterior source of distraction, as you put it, or stimulus, which takes us away from, again, Nietzsche saying, don't drink alcohol, because drinking alcohol just takes you away from your problems rather than having to face them.
Yeah.
And so that idea of becoming who you are, in that you don't need any third-party stimulus or distraction to just be and be content.
Yeah. And
I guess there are a wide variety, which some of which I believe you have experience in Buddhism, of seeking that as often and as permanently as possible. Do you think that's possible?
Well, no, I don't think it's possible. I mean, of course it's possible, but the idea of living in any state of mind, whether it be good or bad, permanently I think is impossible.
And unhealthy.
And unhealthy, and there's a lovely story from Idris Shah, where he tells a story of a Persian emperor who goes to his Sufi teacher and says to him, look, I've got so much and I'm frightened of losing it. I have so much I'm frightened of losing. But I equally take so much pleasure in all the things that I've got, and I lose myself in the pleasure of all the things I've got. So I move from the pleasure of all the things I've got to the fear of losing all the things that I've got. And the Sufi teacher says, well, I'll think about it then. I'll come back to you with a solution. So it comes back to, and he has a ring engraved, and on the surface of the ring is, this too shall pass. And the idea, whenever the emperor is excited by all that he's got, he looks at the ring and this too shall pass. And when he is despairing at the thought of losing all that he's got, he looks at the ring and he says, this too shall pass. So in a sense, we live with that sense of the transition between the good. And the idea of being able to stay in a permanent state of happiness, for example, is nonsense. We can't. It's not possible. Because happiness happens. We can't make ourselves happy. We can give ourselves pleasure, and our society is very good at giving us pleasure. We can buy pleasure. We can create pleasure. Pleasure is sold to us. The economy works on the sale of pleasure.
And convenience.
And convenience. But we confuse pleasure with happiness to our peril, because happiness is not pleasure. We can be happy with nothing.
And over your career, have you had a sense of problems changing or morphing, or society's pressures changing and morphing, and therefore, your treatment changing and morphing, perhaps? Well,
I think I probably have seen things change. Maybe not perhaps in the ways that you're pointing to, but certainly there's been elements of things different. Different things are brought to me, and therefore different things are being suffered by us than perhaps they were suffered 40 years ago. I know that, for example, when I was first practicing as a psychotherapist, there were two other psychotherapists in the town where I live. And now there are hundreds of psychotherapists and counsellors. There's counselling training producing 30 or so qualified counsellors every year, in the vicinity. So there is therefore a market. Yeah. There is a business called counselling. There's a business called psychotherapy, which obviously existed, but wasn't presented in the way it is now. I mean, to find a psychotherapist, not many people thought about finding a psychotherapist. Not many people wanted to find a psychotherapist, and the people who found the way to psychotherapy were very particular at that time, often referred by their doctors or psychiatrists, or people themselves who were wanting to train as a psychotherapist. But I think the sense of the volume of work being done in counselling and psychotherapy at the moment is indicative of a transformation in our society and our culture. That it's very, very self-reflective, very, very, as I would put it, narcissistic, and it doesn't imply that there's any more or less suffering. It's just that there's a certain style of preoccupation.
It's taking a different form.
Yeah, I think so. It's a sort of style of preoccupation. I mean, I can't sure quite what I mean by that, but I think there's a sort of feel you get, which is that everyone's in it now. There's so much of it. And I'm not sure that's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but it's just there's a lot of it, a lot of people doing it. And whereas, 40 years ago, there were just a very few training organizations. Now there are dozens and dozens and dozens throughout the country. And what is that saying about society? And what is it saying about the marketing and the marketization of counselling? And it affects the identity of the psychotherapists or counsellors themselves. It affects how they see themselves, and they see themselves as competing on a market. Whereas before there was no market, so there was no competition. There was just a sense of collegiate, cross-referral that people would do from psychotherapist to psychotherapist or GP to psychotherapist. It's very different now, very much a business and industry. And what does that tell us about the sort of pain and distress that we're suffering from at the moment? Questions to be thought about a bit more, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, capitalist supply and demand. There's a demand, the supply will rise to meet it.
Yeah. And also, my concern is the individualizing of suffering that's involved in that. We can get away with locating unhappiness and suffering in the individual. So we psychologize unhappiness rather than sociologize it, make it social. That the way we're living, the way our society lives, evokes unhappiness, manifests unhappiness in us. And therefore, we see the thing as not needing social change, but needing individual, personal change. And in that way, we lock ourselves away from perhaps the source of our unhappiness. We lock ourselves into the illusion that I suddenly have to become somehow different, another person, better. And if I become better, I will become transformed and be happy. Whereas, of course, maybe what we're back to is this question about it's social change that's required to live happier, healthier lives as an individual in a community.
Well, there's a fantastic idea which I discovered recently that perhaps the one feature that makes us different to any other animal or mammal is that we are civilized and that we can be civil to each other. And so not being civil to each other takes that away. And this idea that how do you want to serve the world and how do you want to help others? How can you help others? How can you serve society? Is sort of getting further and further away from people's priorities.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's about what can I get? Not what I can give, but what can I get?
And that can only come from, society. And where did that start? Where did that come from? What are the decisions that have been made that have got us to this point? I think is something that, talking about unlived lives, you talk about individual unlived lives, but how about sort of the wider picture? Major decisions that have been made that have actually led everyone, or every one of us, all of us, into a society that have gently and gradually morphed society to the point that we're at now. And what if different decisions were made?
Yeah.
And what if, a different political leader was elected or whatever the situation? But exploring that, I think, is something a tangent of the program that I'd be interested to go down.
I can see it's definitely a tangent to it, but I think that as a community, we're living an unlived life. That we're living, if you think about the community, we've got things like global warming. What would it be like for our society to live a different life? To live a life that we've switched tracks somewhere along the last 50 years, or at least since the 1950s, we've switched tracks in such a way that we've got the problem we've got. What would it be like to switch back, to live an unlived life of a different order? But I think the idea of what I think the proliferation of counselling and psychotherapy is doing is individualising and psychologizing in the individual unhappiness, rather than seeing unhappiness as something that arises from the way of life we have, and then is experienced at an individual level. And of course, if we're continually put back on us as well, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to change? Then, of course, the whole issue of political change is sort of hived off. We don't have to have political change. We just have to have individual change. Yeah. It doesn't matter how many cans of beans we store in our cellars. We're still not going to have enough cans of beans to feed us when the global warming takes off. We can't individually preserve ourselves from the social change and the ecological changes that we're seeing around us. But of course, we're encouraged to think like that. Where are we, Jack?
We're right on time. So I think probably lastly, in a hope to sort of understand, what do you feel the root cause is?
The root cause of
the situation that we're in.
That's a big question, isn't it? Because I don't know. I don't know what the root cause is. I don't think anyone can know. I think there's so many overlapping and overlaying reasons for where we are that it's not possible to reduce it to one thing. One of the big things, I think, is that we are sold on the idea that our lives can be improved by the level of pleasure we have. And as long as we believe that life is about pleasure and being pleased and pleasing each other in terms of the level of pleasure we can give to each other or we can get from each other, then as long as we do that, then we're caught in an economy which will always be able to promote pleasure and sell us pleasure.
Because you're never truly able to become who you are, or find contentment, or be happy, rather than joyful.
Yeah, that's right.
Because you're constantly perpetuated this idea.
The point about pleasure is that it's a function of desire. And when we have desires which are met, we only have the desires replaced by other desires. Because we're creatures with desire, we just want things. We're just desiring machines, as it were. And you can never have enough. And our society works on that principle. You can never have enough. You can never have enough happiness. And if happiness is confused with pleasure, then you're lost. Because you can have lots and lots of happiness without having any pleasure as such.
Peter Berry, thank you so much for talking to me today. I really, really appreciate you coming on the show.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been absolutely wonderful to have you. If you enjoyed this conversation with Peter, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you're listening via the podcast, please do give the show a rating and a review. I hope you enjoyed listening.